So you just received a pallet of new network equipment and you need to begin configuring them for deployment across your network. But where do you begin? Well, luckily, most vendors provide a list of basic configuration items for you to be able to deploy your device across your network and manage it remotely. Recommended initial configurations will vary by vendor, however, they typically will include IP addressing, host name, user information, and remote access protocol configuration. Deja vu. For today's video, we're going to be going through the initial configuration of Cisco switches and routers, which vary slightly in how you have to go about the initial configuration just based on the basic differences between switches and routers. For this video, we managed to secure a Cisco 3650 switch and a Cisco 4321 ISR router. With no more gilding the lily, let's get at it. Alright, so we're going to begin by logging into the Cisco router. So all Cisco routers by default will have a host name of router. All Cisco devices will default to whatever their device is designed to do. So all Cisco switches will have a host name of switch when you power them up out of the box. All Cisco routers will have a hostname router. Easy enough. So you can tell here in this prompt that we are logged into a router on boot up. We are logged in as user exec and we need to escalate our privileges if we want to perform a initial configuration. So we're going to have to type the word enable, or if you're using Cisco shorthand, EN will get the job done. However, this still doesn't provide us the permissions we need to make configuration changes on this device. So we're going to have to escalate our privileges once again into global configuration mode. So we're going to have to type the words configure terminal or just conf t will get the job done. So the first thing you're probably going to want to do is change the host name so you can tell which device you're actually working with. In this case, I'm going to change my host name to my RTR or my router. Now, one thing that you're going to want to do quite often is copy your current running configuration to your startup configuration file. So if your device has to reboot for any reason, you can always go back in and pick back up right where you left off. In this case, it is copy run start. However, copy is a command that is designed to run from privileged exec mode. So if we're going to do it from here in config mode, we're going to want to type the word do in front of it to force it to run. The next thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to set a global password for this device. This is a security measure to make sure that no one can just connect with a console cable and get immediate access without any kind of authentication. You can use enable password to set a password. However, this is plain text and is extremely poor security practice. So that's why we're going to go with enable secret instead, so that it is more difficult for anyone to reverse engineer the password on this device. In this case, I'm going to go super secure and go with a password that is password 01. If we do a show run config, you can see that we have enabled a password and it is displayed in an MD5 hash. This can be reverse engineered and does take a little bit of time, so the more complex you make your password, the longer it is for anyone to be able to actually break in if they really wanted to. Next up, we're going to want to create usernames which also have passwords. This is necessary if we want to use the SSH protocol in order to connect to this device remotely instead of having to be physically connected to it via a console cable. In this case, I'm going to create a user named Brainmelt, and I'm going to specify that it has a privilege level of 15. Some iOS versions will just automatically assume that it has the highest level of privilege, which is 15. Others will actually automatically assume the lowest level of privilege. So you do want to make sure that you specify this even though it might not be included in whatever documentation comes with your device. In this case, I'm also going to use secret instead of password in order to make sure that its password is displayed in an MD5 hash. So here you can see the username Brainmelt privilege 15 and its password is displayed as an MD5 hash instead of plain text. The next thing we're going to want to do is we need to set IP addressing. So we're going to select one of the interfaces on our router and we're going to give it an IP address. In this case, we're going to go with interface gigabit Ethernet 000. And one thing to remember about routers is their interfaces are actually powered down by default. So if you do put IP addresses on them, it doesn't mean that you're actually going to connect to some other device if you plug a cable in. You actually require an additional command, and that is the no shutdown command in order to power it up. Next up, we're going to set our IP address, which is just done using the IP address command. We can either specify DHCP so that it pulls automatically if you have a DHCP server set up, or in our case, we're just going to go ahead and set a static IP ourselves. In this case, I'm going to go with 10, 20, 30, 40. Easy enough. Next up, we're going to want to configure our virtual teletype lines, or VTY lines, to permit SSH traffic to connect to this device. By default on routers, there are 5 VTY lines, though some of your larger, more powerful ones may have more. This allows up to 5 separate SSH connections at once, and they are numbered 0 through 4. So in this case, we're going to specify line VTY 0 through 4. Next, we're going to want to go with transport input and whatever protocols we wish to allow. In this case, we have several options. However, the only one that we really want to use here is going to be SSH for our purposes. The next thing we want to do is we want to specify how we're going to authenticate with this device. Are we going to authenticate locally? Are we going to just authenticate with a password? Or are we going to authenticate using a AAA server? In this case, we're going to go log in local using that username that we created in an earlier step. Of course, we don't want to forget copy run start. Now it's time to test our configuration. So let's go ahead and attempt to log in via SSH. We're prompted with an RSA key, and we're in. This initial configuration is done on our router. Now it's time to move on to the initial configuration of our switch. It's going to follow the same basic formula. We're going to want to set a host name. We're going to want to set a root password, and we're also going to want to set a username and password as well. We're also going to want to configure the VTY lines to permit SSH traffic just like we did on the router. However, this is where things get a little bit different. Switches do not have the ability to put an IP address directly on the interface, at least not without some very specific configuration going on. So that is why instead we use a virtual interface to allow IP addressing to be placed directly on it. By default, all Cisco switches come configured with all of their interfaces attached to VLAN number 1. What a VLAN is and what it does is kind of beyond the scope of this video. However, it's best practice to not use VLAN 1. This goes a little bit beyond the scope of initial configuration as far as Cisco is concerned. However, this is part of a basic setup for VLANs that you will want to do regardless of whether you include this in your initial configuration or whether you're moving on. So the first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to make sure that none of your interfaces are on VLAN number 1. So we're going to create a new VLAN called VLAN number 10, and we're just going to name it Brainmelt. We're also going to want to make sure that we turn on our VLAN 10 interface. Otherwise, you can't actually connect to it. After we've created VLAN 10, named it, and turned the VLAN interface associated with it on, we want to make sure that we actually assign some of the interfaces on this switch to that VLAN. In this case, I'm just going to assign Gigabit Ethernet 1 through 4. You assign interfaces to VLANs using the switch port access VLAN and whatever number you assign to it. If we do a show VLAN command, we can see now that we have 2 VLANs. VLAN number 1 and VLAN number 10, and interfaces 1 through 4 are on VLAN 10, everything else is still on VLAN 1. Now it's time to create what's called a black hole VLAN, or sometimes a parking lot VLAN. This is where you put all of your interfaces that are not in use. You want to assign these to a different VLAN for security purposes. So in this case, we're going to create a new VLAN, and we're going to call this VLAN number 666. And we're going to go ahead and name this VLAN Girls, a nice little callback to the Waterboy. Little girls are the devil, Bobby Boucher. And now we're going to assign all of the unused interfaces to that black hole VLAN. Another important step is that you want to make sure that all of these are powered down. So you want to use the shutdown command to turn all of these interfaces off. Next thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to make sure that you have an IP address assigned to the interface associated with VLAN number 10. This is what you're going to connect to if you're using an SSH session. Another step that we didn't mention for older devices is that you also have to manually generate an RSA key. In this case, you need to have a domain name set on the device in order to do that. So in this case, we're going to go with a domain name of brainmelt.local, and then we need to generate an RSA key for the encrypted traffic that's going to be passing across our SSH connection. So in this case, we're going to go crypto key generate RSA, and we're going to set this as a 1024-bit RSA key, although you can go all the way up to 4096 now. One final thing that you're going to want to set on your switch is to set a default gateway. This way, if your switch needs to pass any traffic outside of its own network, it knows how to reach whatever router is in your network. In this case, I'm just going to set an imaginary one because I'm not going to be sending information directly from the switch out. So it's just 10.20.30.45 is the IP address I will give it. It will automatically assume the same subnet mask as whatever interface it sees that is in that same subnet as the default gateway. So let's go ahead and test out this connection using PuTTY. And just like last time, we're in. So there you have it. That was the initial configuration for your devices. If you have any questions or comments, I'd love it if you drop those down below. Until next time, it's been real, and we hope to see you all here next time on Brainmelt University.